Hi, hello, good evening. Welcome back to the TCS Academy for Competition. So, dear friends, today in this session, I will take you through the important topic for all the competitive examinations, that is Basel 3. So, in the previous video, we have covered the Basel 1 and Basel 2. So, in this particular session, in this today's test session, so we are going to discuss in detail about the Basel 3 norms. So before going to understand the Basel 3 norms, so let's discuss what is exactly the Basel norms. Okay, the Basel norms or Basel Accord, okay, which are set of agreements. Basel Accord is a set of agreements. So these set of agreements which are designed by the BCBS, right? These are designed by BCBS, right? Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So this particular committee, it has designed the Basel norms or Basel Accord. So which provides this particular committee, which provides recommendations to the central banks on banking regulations in regard to the banking risks. Is that clear? Basel Accord or Basel norms or the set of agreements which are designed by the BCBS, which provides the recommendations to the central banks of the member countries of the BCBS on banking regulations in regard to the banking risks. So this is all about the meaning of Basel norms. So now, till today, till date, so we have three Basel norms. BCBS has designed the three norms for all the central banks in the world. Okay, in the form of Basel 1, Basel 2 and Basel 3. Collectively, these three Basel norms which are considered as Basel Accord. Right? Now, let's straight away move on to our topic for the discussion today, Basel 3. So basically, what is the objective? The Basel 3 is a comprehensive set of reform measures, okay, towards the banking system across the globe. Basel 3 is a comprehensive set of reforms which are applicable, which are open for acceptance by all the central banks of the country, world, right? So why these Basel 3 norms? What are the aims of Basel norms? Number one, to improve the banker's ability to absorb the financial shock. To improve bankers' ability to absorb the financial shock. Number one. Number two, to improve the risk management and good governance. To improve risk management and good governance in the banking system. Number three, to strengthen the bank's transparency and disclosure, right? So third important aim of Basel 3 is to strengthen the bank's transparency and disclosure. So these are the three aims for the introduction of the Basel 3, right? Okay. This Basel 3, it has basically it has two important components. The two important components in the Basel 3. The two important components, right? There are two important components which can be seen in the Basel 3. One is capital and liquidity. About the capital of a bank and liquidity position of the bank, certain guidelines which are set, which are designed by the BCBS and recommended to all the central banks to accept and design the banking structure accordingly to maintain the sufficient cash in the form of capital and maintain the sufficient liquidity. As I mentioned, the Basel III has two important components. One component is related to the capital, and other components of the Basel III is mainly focusing on liquidity, right? Okay. Now let's take up the first important components of the Basel III, capital requirement. Capital has three pillars. One is capital risk coverage and containing leverage. Capital has three pillars. Number one is capital risk coverage and containing leverage. Okay. Number two, risk management and supervision. Risk management and supervision. The third important pillar, which is mentioned under the capital of Basel III, the third important pillar is market discipline. Okay, so these are the three pillars the capital includes. Number one is capital risk coverage and containing leverage. Okay, number two, risk management and supervision. Number three pillar under the capital, market discipline, right? Okay. Now let's understand these three important pillars. As per the Basel III, the capital has three pillars. One is capital and risk coverage and containing leverage, right? Okay. The pillar one. Let's take up the first important thing. Pillar one. Capital is a liability the bank owes to the investors because the investors have put their money in banks by purchasing the debt instruments and as well as shares, right? So therefore, the capital is a liability the bank owes to investors. Capital norms are fixed in proportion to asset. What percentage of asset the bank has and what percentage capital a reserve must be there in the bank, right? Capital norms which are fixed in proportion to assets. As we know, which are the assets? Assets of the banks are nothing but the loans. Whenever a banker has given the loans and advances to the public, those loans of a bank which are considered as assets. So therefore, assets are the investment made by the banks, which we call it as loans, right? Okay. So now let's have a breakup of capital requirements given under the Basel III. Okay, the breakup. Breakup of capital requirements. The breakup of capital requirements, right? Tier 1 capital, it must be 6.0% as per the Basel III. Tier 1 capital, under the tier 1 capital we have a common equity. It is also called as a paid up capital. It must be 4.5% as per the Basel III. And one more important component it has taken under the tier 1 capital as far as the Basel III is concerned, that is additional tier 1 capital, that must be 1.5%, right? 1.5%. Okay. Then Okay. So other components in the tier 1 capital, other components, retained earnings and as well as preference shareholders, right? Capital of preference shareholders, retained earnings plus preference shareholders capital, right? So this is these two or the other components which comes under the tier 1. So it must be 2%. It must be 2% as far as Basel 3 is concerned. Okay, put together total tier 1 capital. Under the tier 1 capital we come across equity capital. Okay, the one component. Under the tier 1 capital itself we have a retained earnings and another important component, so that we call it as, it must be 2%. 2% plus 6%. Put together it is 8%. Right? It is 8%. The capital is required. Minimum capital requirement as per the Basel norms 3. It should be 8%. But the Basel 3 has prescribed the minimum capital requirement is 8%, but Indian government, Indian RBI, or our RBI, our central bank has fixed at 9%, right? So in that, there are three important components which comes under the tier 1 capital. Tier 1 capital is capital requirement according to the Basel 3. Okay, the Basel 3 has mentioned that the 4.5% must be maintained as a reserve in the form of equity capital, right? Equity capital must be 4.5%, and additional tier 1 capital it must be 1.5%. So this is another important component which has been mentioned in the Basel 3. Okay, in the tier 1 capital itself we have a retained earnings and preference shareholders capital. It must be 2%. Equity capital must be 6%, and retained earnings and preference shareholders capital must be 2%. Total it should be 8% prescription capital requirement by the Basel 3, right? Okay. What is this additional tier 1 capital? Additional tier 1 capital is investment that are debt in nature but do not have a maturity period. Okay. Additional tier 1 capital, it is by issuing the debt instruments. Okay. Therefore, the investments that are debt in nature but the bankers borrowed capital, right? Additional tier 1 capital is nothing but the investments that are debt in nature but do not have a maturity period. It can be realized if the issuer to do so. Okay, this additional tier 1 capital can be realized if the banker wishes to do so, right? Now let's move on to the tier 2 capital. Tier 2 capital. Tier 2 capital. Tier 2 capital. It is a tier 2 capital is a borrowed capital, right? Tier 2 capital is a borrowed capital. It is a less secure capital. Less secure. Okay. Tier 1 capital is more secure. Tier 1 capital. Tier 1 capital is more secure and tier 2 capital is a less secure. So tier 2 capital, it is similar to additional tier 1 capital but has a maturity period of at least 5 years, right? Tier 2 capital is similar to the additional tier 1 capital, but has a maturity period of at least 5 years. Is that clear? Both of them have a right to claim next to the depositors. At general conditions, general creditors, they have neither secured nor guaranteed by the issuer. Okay. So both of them, additional tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital. So both of them have a right to claim next to the depositors and general creditors, and they are neither secured nor guaranteed by the issuer. Over and above 8% minimum capital requirement, Basel III has added there is a need to maintain a capital conservation buffer, right? As per the Basel III is concerned, capital conservation buffer, it must be 2.5%. Okay, 2.5%. According to the Basel III, capital conservation buffer must be 2.5% along with the 8% capital minimum capital requirement that has been set, that has been recommended. Clear? Over and above 8% minimum capital requirement, there is a need by the banker to maintain a capital conservation buffer, 2.5% as far as Basel III is concerned. And now let's understand what is this capital conservation buffer. When cyclical systematic, okay, when cyclical systematic risk is judged to be increasing, the banking institution should accumulate the capital to create the buffer. So therefore, the banks should strengthen the resilience of the banking sector during the period of financial stress. Okay, during the period of financial stress. So in order to strengthen the resilience of the banking sector, 2.5% capital conservation buffer has been suggested by the BCBS. Okay, so this is one of the important the term which has been important components which has been added as far as Basel III is concerned. Okay, normally it can be from 0 to 2.5%, and there can be an add-on of 2.5% more. Total it must be 5%, right? Total it must be 5%. So therefore, capital conservation buffer, normally it can be from 0 to 2.5%, and there can be add-on of 2.5% more, and we can put together 5% that is left for the banks. During the normal business operations, during the normal business process, so this particular capital conservation buffer, it must be 0. Okay, counter cyclical capital buffer target is 0 in our country. So because 0 counter cyclical capital buffer, right? Especially the country like India. Next important, the pillar under the part 1, that is called as leverage ratio. It is a ratio between the capital measures and exposure measures, right? Leverage is the ratio between the capital measures and exposure measures. Capital measures refers to tier 1 capital, and exposure measures refers to the assets and created by the banks and other financial institutions. What are the assets which are created by the banks and other financial institutions, which refers to exposure measures? Okay, capital measures is tier 1 capital, equity capital and retained earnings, and as well as preference shareholders capital. Clear? The banks are expected to maintain a leverage ratio of at least 3%. Leverage ratio, bank has to maintain at least 3%. This is one of the important the recommendations by the BCBS as far as Basel III is concerned. So this is all about capital. Now let's move on to understand the liquidity position of the bank. Right? Liquidity. The second important component of Basel III, that is called liquidity. Liquidity. Right? Okay. The key principle of liquidity is number one. The key principles of liquidity of a banker is LCR and NSFR, right? Liquid coverage ratio, number one, LCR. Net stable funding ratio. So these are the key principles which are suggested by the Basel III as far as liquidity of the bank is concerned. Okay, the key principles of the liquidity of a bank is two. One is LCR and NSFR. LCR stands for liquidity coverage ratio and NSFR net stable funding ratio. So dear friends, so let's understand what is all this LCR. What is this LCR? Okay, one of the important the principle of liquidity of the bank according to the Basel III is LCR, liquidity coverage ratio. A bank has to have adequate stock of unencumbered high quality liquid assets. High quality liquid assets the bank have to maintain against the risks. Okay, so that can be converted into cash easily and immediately in the private market so that the banker can withstand a liquidity crisis. In times of crisis, especially in times of liquidity crisis, the banker has to maintain adequate stock of unencumbered high quality liquid assets. So those liquid assets which can be converted easily into cash and immediately that can be disposed and converted into cash in the private market in order to face effectively and efficiently when the liquidity crisis arises in the bank. If it happens for a period of 30 days. Okay, and this particular LCR has to be implemented, okay, by all the member countries, right? That is all about LCR. So there is one more important the principle of liquidity of the banking system, that is called NSFR. Net stable funding ratio. Okay, so this can be obtained by calculating a thing that is called, how do we calculate the net stable funding ratio? Net stable funding ratio can be obtained by available stable funding, required stable funding into 100. Okay, so what is available stable funding? What is the fund that the banker has actually, And what is the requirement? Required or expected, the stable funding. Okay, so available stable funding can be divided by the required stable funding into 100. So there we can able to get net stable funding ratio. It should be always liquidity position the banker has to maintain. And now let's discuss some of the important the data which are released as far as Basel III is concerned. As far as the Basel III is concerned, Basel III norms, according to the Basel III norms, equity capital ratio, it must be 4.5%, right? So the minimum tier 1 capital as far as Basel III is concerned, 6%, right? Okay. Tier 2 capital as far as Basel III is concerned, it must be 2%, right? So minimum total capital adequacy, it must be 8%, correct? 6 plus 2, 8% as far as Basel III is concerned. But 9% it has been fixed by Reserve Bank of India. Capital conservation buffer, CCB, it must be 2.5%, and minimum total capital plus capital conservation buffer, it must be 10.5% as far as Basel III is concerned. Okay, is that clear? Basel III has fixed the equity ratio, it must be equity ratio as far as Basel III is concerned, it is 4.5%, and minimum tier 1 capital, it must be 6%, and tier 2 capital is 2%. Minimum total capital including tier 1 and tier 2 capital, it must be 8%, and as far as RBI is concerned, so we have set at 9%. Okay, so next, capital conservation buffer, it must be 2.5% as far as Basel III is concerned, and minimum total capital plus capital conservation buffer put together, it is fixed at 10.5%. Okay, and as far as liquidity is concerned, liquidity coverage ratio, it must be 100% as far as Basel III is concerned. Next, net stable fund ratio, it must be 100%, right? So this is all about the Basel III. The Basel III and India. The Basel III capital requirements, the capital regulations have been implemented in India since 1st April 2013 in a phased manner. The above numbers, which are subject to change as far as revised the guidelines of the Reserve Bank of India. Is that clear? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day.